We're going to look at there are many things about the Bingham pit that one can look into, but I guess maybe 3 or 4 months ago, Mike Koss and I were talking, and he said that the mining history group would like to see something about the evolution of the open pit. And of course, the pit's been operating now for 115 years, so there are many aspects that have happened since the early 1900s until now. And just to give you an orientation, here is the pit as it appeared in 1976. Lower Bingham Canyon, what was approximately the old Upper Bingham Canyon, which is essentially where mining started in the open pit. Car Fork, which at one time was a branch canyon off of Bingham Canyon, in which there were numerous lead and silver mines built, developed between 1863 and the early 1900s, as well as a few up in this northern end of the, or southern end of the Upper Bingham Canyon. And actually off to the side here, the old U.S. smelting Lark mine had its entrance portal. And some of the areas here, let's see here. Here we go. This area up in here, these notches were in the truck shop were constructed in the mid and late 60s as the upper levels of the pit were transitioned from rail operations to haulage trucks. So let's start our sequential history of what's happened in the last 100-odd years. Here is the Bingham Canyon lower area just below Car Fork, and you can see the original mountain, which was in the fork between Upper Bingham Canyon and Car Fork, and it was what essentially constitutes the majority of the mining. And this picture is from 1900, which is 6 years before the start of open pit operations. Open pit techniques initially were started in this country on the Iron Range in northern Minnesota, and Daniel Jackling, who instituted the Utah copper operation, he spent a lot of time up there in the 1890s and early 20th century studying how they were operating. And up higher on the mountain, a group called the Boston Consolidated Mining Company actually started operations a few months earlier, but they were essentially using the same techniques. And these two pictures here reflect the initial first mining cuts in early part and mid 1906. And by 1910, Boston Consolidated had been merged into Utah Copper, largely because they were having problems with their ore treatment to make concentrate. And Utah Copper had become concerned about the safety aspects of having a open pit mining operation over its head. Here we're looking at some pictures from 1907. The upper picture gives you a sense of the early levels of the Boston Consolidated up on the higher levels of the mountain. And you can see here some of the accesses from Upper Car Fork to get up into these elevations. Here's some of the support facilities for Boston Consolidated. Utah Copper was down on the lower levels, and they all had started their initial cuts from the Car Fork area, working south around the west side, or, what's the east side of the mountain and became the west side of the pit. And here's another perspective down below that gives you some greater sense of the orientation of the mining operations and the Bingham Canyon itself. Some of this area over in here, and I have not traced out all of the locations and exactly who, but the DNRG Railroad actually built a line clear up into Bingham Canyon from the Salt Lake Valley. And there were branch lines that extended up into the Carr Fork area. So in the early days, the ore was shipped out of here on the Rio Grande Railroad, although the Utah Copper did have an early concentrator actually in lower Bingham Canyon, to where they developed the early techniques, which were gravity concentration, before they built their large mill at Magna, Utah, over near the Great Salt Lake. Here is, as things look, the clearer picture that shows the 1909 or 1910. It's interesting. We're going to get the pictures as I looked at them, trying to find specific dates for them. In some cases were difficult, and sometimes I'd find the same picture in with different dates attached to it, but if they were relatively close together, I posted both dates. You can see here the rail yard and the early first stage of the machine shop complex that Utah Copper built to support the operations. More of their cuts were up into this area, but gradually what happens is they mine across here, and you had the mountain that was kind of bellied out to the east. And as time went on, 1912, it's quite flat. It's quite a flat area. And the east side here was used for some of the access and transportation auxiliary support. There's a better copy of this print I found of interest in Colorado Springs at the one of the early investors in the Broadmoor also was some of the early money that went into the Utah Copper funding. And so I was able to, this picture originally, I couldn't find a date for it, but I did have a copy of the picture of Colorado Springs, which was identical. So that's how I was able to peg the date. And then we jump. There's some of this, there are times that I found looking at picture sequences where there's quite a number of years of gap, but this jumps us from 1912 to the 1920s or 1930. And what's interesting, you can see how much more expansive the operation has become. Much of what we see, come here, up in here are some of the early waste dumps that were built here before they started to build a series of bridges, which allowed them to dump waste up on this north side. Here's lower Bingham Canyon. There was an early dump line built during the 19-teens that actually came out this side to the waste dumps. And here we see the B&G Railroad line, which Utah Copper built to be able to haul ore from the mine to the concentrators over on the Great Salt Lake without having to rely on the DNRG Railroad. So you've got the, similar to what we saw earlier, here's the yard, the machine shop area, the A-level bridge that came across at about the 6340 elevation and into this is where the mine brought its ore cars to be assembled into trains. Then B&G brought them in smaller cuts over to this yard and made long ore haul trains. And it was in this complex in here where the mine office building was also established in about 1914. And they were still using that office building in the 60s and early 70s when I worked at Bingham. Feel free to ask any questions if anybody has any as we go along here. There's a lot of material, and we can certainly go back and look further at some particular points in time or features if you want to.
Well, John, could I ask a question right now? Do you have any idea how they coordinated between the Boston and the other company in terms of one of them's mining above the other one? And it seems like you could get into some problems there pretty quickly.
Well, that was a big part of why the two companies were merged. Okay. Is there was I don't know, I can't supply you with any details, but it's rather obviously looking at how they were positioned that that did become a problem. That certainly was presented a problem. And the other thing which I did find is some comments specifically that Boston Con was having problems with the processing of their ore.
Do they have problems with flash flooding?
I don't really know. This pit, in the time I was there, really water management was not a particular problem.
But looking at this picture, I mean, this is a perfect setup for all the lower Bingham Canyon to be wiped out by a flash flood.
Yeah, it never really, I never saw anything extensive about it. It was just, I do know that with the canyon in the narrow confines, I know there was a lot of a great deal of concern over civic sanitation. As we move on from the early 30s and further in, we see two things become very apparent. One, we're beginning to see the cuts being established up here on what became the east side of the pit. And given the way they've been established, it looks like they're fairly early in their development. So it's very likely that this started in the later 1920s, because this is the first picture of everything I looked at. And it was labeled 1931, to where we see the what became the east side of the pit start really extensive development. And over here on the west side, we're seeing the mountain get pushed back to the point where now we're getting what becomes very much a bowl looking shape. And down here is about the same time we can see more of the western area here and the canyon, the old yard and shops, and more of the dump lines being developed here on the out from the east side of the pit. Here's an aerial picture in 1935 showing more of the western side of the pit. You're beginning to see waste dumps also from the west side of the pit. Now that they've pretty much filled in this area here, they built a series of bridges across Carr Fork for waste dump lines, and you can see the early stages of the dumping as that was developed. Here's that A-line bridge we were talking about earlier, and also the Markham Bridge down below here. This is 1940, looking from the north side of Car Fork toward the south end of the pit, and the area there is Copperfield. It's quite interesting as one looks at the sequence of the pit development. The levels from east and west are starting to get tied together, and consequently, they're beginning to get intertwined with the village. And so by 1958, the village was totally abandoned. Some of these, fortunately, are copies of actual Utah copper pictures, and they do have the prints dated, which made it quite nice to look at. The other thing that's quite interesting when one looks at this picture in detail is by 1940, they had just begun to get into the full revolving shovels. And so one sees quite a number of the old standard shovels that only had a 180-degree swing. Here's 1947. The thing I wanted to call attention is the pit finally was getting to the depth where it was determined that the most economic way to operate, as the benches went deeper, was to build tunnels out from the pit out into Bingham Canyon. And here was the first one that went into operation in 1944. And it is the 6040 level. And we're right on the bottom. The west side is at about the same time. I wasn't able to be sure of the date quite as well, but the similarity of the benches and the lighting. And you can see one of the things about the rail operations that really made it very intensive manpower wise is you had to line the track as you advance the cuts and relocate parallel to the track all these towers that carried the electric catenary, because by the time starting in 1926, the pit was converted from steam locomotives to electric locomotives for handling the trains. And again, we have pretty well got the pit, as we see, for probably the better part of 40 years or more, the pit's almost a circle. The only thing that there is no mining, and they put a series of switchbacks, was on the north side of the pit here. Anaconda had bought up virtually all of the Car Fork mineral properties by 1940, and the only rights Kennecott was able to get for Utah Copper on that land was the access for the dump lines and being able to dump, but they actually weren't able to mine on the north side until after 1986. These are the first two colored pictures from 1948. The one on the upper left is quite similar to the one we were just looking, but it's a little different angle. And you can see the very distinct changes in color between the rock types. And the gray is largely the porphyry material. And the lower right here, we have the east side of the pit looking toward the south, but we've also can see the size of the machine shop area as it finally developed. And by the early 50s, it was removed because it became the way the way things were configured for it, it was interfering with operations, and they built replacement shops down Bingham Canyon at an area called Dry Fork. Here's 1950. You can see here in the lower part here, some of the dump leaching, the leaching ponds. They had started doing leaching as early back in the 1920s, and so there had been operations to extract copper from it. But unlike a lot of the Arizona ores, there's very, very little oxide material in this ore. So dump leaching did not yield a large amount of copper, and the mineralization is quite slow to oxidize. The sulfide minerals are quite slow to oxidize. So they were very, the best way to get leach copper over the years was to put new areas under leach and get that early flush. The inherent oxide content of this ore was only about 0.02 copper. And the bench heights, and typically while they varied somewhat over the years, they were, in the early days, they might vary from 50 to 75 feet, but by the time we get into this period, everything is pretty much a standard 50 foot. And you can see where Copperfield here is gradually getting taken away by the encroaching levels. This is a similar picture as the previous one, but you can see more clearly the way the leach ponds were set up. At one time, in the 60s, they were pumping up onto the dumps over quite an area, about 50,000 gallons a minute of leaching water. And here, over here are the rail lines to the dump lines out this way. This is 1966. And these are some pictures taken from different, looking at different parts of the pit from the north side visitors area in about the month of October. This is the bottom of the pit at that time. It was down to 5490. And this is the pit portal for the 5490 tunnel, which was an 18,000 foot long tunnel, went into service in the early 1960s. And it is the tunnel through which the present conveyor from the in-pit crusher goes to the Copperton concentrator. This is just another variety of pictures from 1973, but I found it interesting in looking at these, and I haven't looked at them for quite a number of years, is how flat the slopes are for this pit compared to so many pits you see. The general operating slopes in the pit during the time I worked there was anywhere from 23 and a half degrees to 25 and a half degrees. And yet the ultimate pit slopes, when it's finally steepened up, the geotechnical work indicated that they would be steepened in some areas to as much as 37 degrees. This area up in here shows the layout of the truck operations, which started in the late 1963. this will give you an idea of the layout. This is again a picture of 73, but it shows rather nicely where the 6040, the 5840 tunnel from 1950 that began in 1952, and then the 5490 tunnel. This is 1982. This is from a different direction that we've been looking at. There's a viewpoint up over the pit up on a place called West Mountain, which was west of the pit, and you have to get to it from the west side of the Okra mountain range. But this is the area of what is the Anaconda property before mining was allowed to start after 1986, when Kennecott acquired the ownership of the property. But because it's quite a contrast when we look at the next picture that will show us what that area became as it got mined. And that is this area here. This is sometime during the early 1990s. These two pictures below here are from the fall of 1997, which is the last time I was at the pit. Some of the areas down at the lower edge, you can see here, since they aren't planning to come down through with another cut anytime soon at this point, they actually double benched this area so that they were approaching an ultimate pit slope. And I really don't know at this point, given what I've read, that the pushbacks have been concentrated on the east side and currently now on the south side. I don't know that this north area will ever have another cut brought down. And this is an aerial picture. Back up here. And the reason I put this in here is this is one of the few straight overhead aerial shots I was able to find. It's after 2000, but it's before the main face slide, which is up here on the northern area. I don't know. I've got a little menu up here on my screen, so I'm not sure if you can see clear up to this upper edge of the picture or not.
Yes, we can.
Okay,
we don't
good.
See whatever your menu is.
Yeah. Excuse me?
We don't see whatever your menu is. We just see the picture.
Yeah, well, that's it. I just wanted to be sure. What's interesting, I went in the 1971, flew over the pit in a small airplane and got some aerial pictures. And depending on when you're looking at the pictures, and even this one, now and then when I look at it, it's almost like it looks, rather than looking like a hole, it looks like a pyramid. The lighting and the shadows change, but you can see how after the mid 80s, there was no more railroad operations in the pit. So you can see how the uniformity of the cuts that were necessary for the rail operation, how the cuts became more blocky and irregular in their shape as they were all chuck cuts. Here is the main face slide. Happened on April 10th, 2013. It was actually composed of two slides about 11 minutes apart. what I find interesting when I look at the pictures is the bulk of the material came up from here and came down over the area at about the 6190 level, and it flowed like a waterfall. It really didn't break down this portion of the pit wall. And you can see here how it slipped over. But it was about 144 million tons of material. The area, the information there will show you the depths of the pit and some of the equipment damage that occurred. They had carefully put all the trucks that they didn't take out of the pit down in the bottom over here against the edge. And as it worked out, the flow of the material was such it still came that far across the pit and buried them.
How much warning was there for the slide?
They actually had days because they had Bingham starting clear back when I was working there and clear up to date. They had an extensive ground movement monitoring system throughout the pit, because there used to be an area over on the west side of the pit called it was called the main hill slide. And they have apparently mined through most of that zone that was causing problem, but that was very extensive. They've not only done ground movements, but they've also done some certain areas. They've done very selective drainage to decrease the amount of back pressure behind the slopes. Fortunately, the slide didn't get into the in-pit crusher and conveyor system. As you can see, it's rather short distance in this zone right here. And here was the first generation truck shop that was built at the 6190 yard area to replace the old Yosemite truck shop. And it just broke off right at the edge of the shop. One of the things I did in conjunction with a mine manager that I had worked with when this first happened, took some of these pictures and the Google Earth, which had a 2010 topography of Bingham, and was able to work out a fairly decent rendition of what the slope intercept of the slide was up on the upper portion. And this is our last slide, and I bring this one is also from West Mountain. You can see very clearly what has happened in this area, and you can see how this is flatter, and then this area down below here, we talked about the double benching earlier, how that is steepened, and that the levels and the main haul road have been reestablished, and there is the remnant of the slide. I do not know exactly what year this is, but I'm sure it's probably 3 or 4 years after the slide occurred, which would put it in probably 2018. And right now they are concentrating on a 1,000 foot wide pushback on the south side of the pit, which will extend the pit life to the year 2032 and will ultimately take the pit depth to slightly over 4,000 feet. So a lot has happened in 115 years, from the original mountain and underground mining to a rather impressive open pit. And I've been to many of the pits around the world. I still find this one to be the one that, particularly if you've worked there, it'll bring you back. Just so many things have happened. And one of the ways, this is a waste dump that they built out from the 6190 elevation. There's the current day shop. But they decided to fill Bingham Canyon with waste. And when I visited there in 1997, I was told that I was probably the last person to ever drive up the old Bingham Highway to get up to the operations through the canyon itself. So that concludes the presentation. And if anybody's got some questions or discussion or want to go back and see any of these illustrations, please let me know.
Jack, let me ask one, Jack. In the where the slide was up there, that was all rock. Huh? It was not any dump material up in there.
No, what is here? This, yeah, let me take a moment here. I'm going to go spare me the moment here. I'm going to go find my surface intercept because I can better answer that question. Let's get out of here. Come on. Okay. Let's go find another set of pictures. There we go. Okay, let's see. I'm not sure this pausing is working quite the same way. Oh, I know. Here we go. There we go. Now, let me put this up there. At any rate, here's this is overlaying. This is the shop where you can see it came right down in front of the mining cuts are along here, and these are the old remnants of the dump lines. Now this is solid rock here. The dump lines are a mixture of dump material and solid ground. So I think the best answer to your question, Mike, is on the pit side, it was mined rock, and on the dump lines, it was a mixture. But there were a batch of slip planes up in here, and I think a fault that it finally gave way on, because what was interesting is it was enough into the pit that when they would run a blast across the area, what was down at depth of this set of structures came right under the mine office building, and we got a pretty good shaking every time they blasted.
Wow, that's cool.
If the ultimate pit bottom is going to be around 4,000 feet, I think you said, what's
Yes.
the elevation of the Great Salt Lake?
The highest elevation is about 8,100.
No, but at the bottom of the ultimate pit.
Oh, it's going to be about, let me go back here. Let's get back to our old friend here.
My question is, will the bottom of the pit be below the surface of the Great Salt Lake?
basic answer to your question is yes. But that's also 20 miles away. Because what did we say here? Yeah, bottom of the pit about 4,040 feet. The top is about 8,100.
And from there they go underground, right?
Yep. And the underground complexities here are quite enormous. There's at least 3 different major underground ore bodies. You've got over here on the north, let me put this picture back up because it's easier to point out things. You've got what's called the North Ore Chute, which is a deep underground area over in here. And it's a skarn deposit. At some point deep underneath the pit, there is a large primary molybdenum deposit, which I have read, it would appear it may have grades of the same amount as the Climax mine, in the order of 0.3% moly, as opposed to the ore grade that's taken as a byproduct now, or of about 0.03035. And then if one thinks of the porphyry, copper porphyry, as a molar and 4 roots coming off almost at a 90-degree spacing around the circumference, you've got a big underground porphyry potential. So there's going to be activity. The pit, if it concludes in age 2032, potentially you've got activity here the rest of the 21st century.
Would they block cave that, or how would they mine that?
If they go, well, the molybdenum ore body in the porphyry copper would be is envisioned as a block cave. The skarn ore body is more amenable to a stoping method.
So a question,
Go ahead.
a question completely in a different direction. How are they actually processing the ore? Are they using some sort of leaching process, or is this something that ultimately?
The ore is, okay, there is at the foot of Bingham Canyon in the late 80s, a new semi-autogenous grinding flotation concentrator was built, and it's running at about 150,000 tons per day. That ore then or the concentrate, excuse me, as well as the tailings, are pipelined over to the Great Salt Lake, and there is a flash smelter there that is about I'm going to say probably 4 or 5 generations from the original American smelter that was built there in the early 20th century. And so they produce, at that smelter, they produce a conventional copper anode, which contains all of the precious metals and copper related byproducts. The concentrator also makes a separate molybdenum concentrate, and that concentrate, some of it is converted to molybdic oxide, and those two products then are sent or are sold and processed elsewhere by other companies to produce molybdenum metal. But at this, there's also over at the nearby the smelter is a refinery which was built originally in 1953, and that mill, that refinery, in recent years has adopted much of the Mount Isa refining technology, and it's something over 200,000 tons a year copper refining capacity. The smelter is about 300,000 tons a year. So as far as the majority of the production out of here is pretty much a conventional sulfide copper ore processing supply chain. They also do have continuing dump leaching, and they have an SXCW plant, so they are producing cathodes directly here at Bingham from that material, rather than making what they used to call a cement copper, which was high grade and would send that to the smelter.
Thank you.
John, how are the tailings managed from this mine?
They're all the tailings. The tailings have been located over at the old Garfield at the old Garfield concentrators. The Union Pacific Railroad has had to relocate itself twice to take care of the enlarging tailings pond. Is generally speaking, I don't think the tailings pond is more than 250 feet high. So rather than a big high tailings pond that you see in many copper concentrators, they've chosen acreage as opposed to height.
Okay, it's subaqueous then, or is it a stack?
It was pretty much, it used to be the tailings went in there just from a thickener. Now, whether they've gone to any enhanced dewatering in recent years, I don't know. You have to go back quite a number of years to find any, any dam problems that resulted in any spills. And the spills were, even at that time, the one I could think of was comparatively minor and not into a situation that was going to cause a lot of difficulty as far as damaging other facilities. It's quite a lot of there's a lot of acreage there. I would suggest probably the best way to get a picture of that is to look at Google Maps and use the satellite view and look at that area. You'll see most everything there. I've got one picture. I've got in my railroad collection. I've got a picture of the 1,200-foot stack as well as the old 300-foot stacks before the days of modern smelting. One of the things that's interesting, there was enough of a commercial market for sulfuric acid, and there was an interest in dump leaching or low-grade ore leaching, that an acid plant was built for the old American smelting smelter at a rather early stage in its operating life.
Thank you.
What can you say about water management in the pit? Even though this is an arid area, it's a big pit and there are still ravines draining into it.
It's
How much
surprising.
water, what do you do with it?
I don't know what's happened since in recent years. I know when I was there, the total water inflow into the bottom of the pit was only about 500 gallons a minute.
Dry out there to make it.
So it was quite an easy problem to manage as far as that. I mean, we seldom had. I mean, there was
Doesn't look acidic. Oh, here's the other.
the worst problem we had with water in the pit from an operating standpoint was the spring snow thaw.
Okay, any other questions? I guess, Jack, if you could release your screen.
I can sure do that.
When we were out there in June, last June, the northern overlook and visitor center has been closed ever since that big slide. So the only way to get this view is to go to this west one he was talking about, and you have to go pretty far south, and you need a pretty good vehicle and make sure the snow's not too bad, and you go way up there on a little toll road. And it's quite a view. That's what my backdrop is, and it's worth it.
I picked up on that. There is about up in this area, there is a new visitor center that they opened in 2019. It was not, when were you out there, last year or earlier? Pardon?
June of 20.
Oh, okay, yeah, because they were not open they didn't open it last year because of the virus.
Yeah, right.
Ordinarily, they open the visitor center April 1st and run through October.
I guess that's more on the south side of the pit now, isn't it, Jack?
No, it's on the east side. It's
Oh, it is.
it's back. It's up above the shop area. It's another way to look at it. It's in between the shop area and the remnants of the slide.
Okay. Wow. All
Well,
right.
thank you very much, Jack. That was very interesting.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed putting it together.
Thank you.
Give some credit to Mike for some of the originating thinking on it.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.